I guess I never thought I'd be the one writing something like this. You see, I used to laugh at stories like the one I'm about to tell. The kind of stuff you hear about in late-night horror videos on YouTube, the creepy tales you swap around campfires when everyone's had a few too many drinks. But now, after what happened to me, I'm not so sure about anything anymore. It all started when I signed up to volunteer at this old cemetery in town. It wasn't a big thing or anything, just helping out cleaning up graves, pulling weeds, that kind of stuff. Most people probably wouldn't think it's a great way to spend your free time, but I've always liked history. There's something peaceful about it too. Walking between all the old gravestones, reading the names, imagining who they were, what their lives must have been like. Anyway, this cemetery wasn't one of those well-kept, fancy places. It was old, really old, and overgrown in a lot of areas. A lot of the graves had been neglected for years, moss and dirt covering the headstones, weeds growing up around the plots. Some of the names were barely visible anymore. So, one night, I decided I'd stay late and get a head start on some of the older graves that were way in the back. The sun had already started setting by the time I set up my stuff. A bucket of soapy water, some brushes, and a flashlight. It wasn't like I hadn't been there after dark before, but it was always with other people around. This time it was just me. At first, everything was fine. I was scrubbing away at this one grave, couldn't even read the name on it anymore. The dirt was so caked on, I figured it had probably been years since anyone had even visited it. I was so focused on cleaning it that I didn't even notice when things started to get weird. It started with this cold wind. Now, I know how that sounds. A breeze. Big deal, right? But this wasn't a normal breeze. It came out of nowhere, and it was freezing. Like bone-chilling cold, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe it was just the weather changing. But then I heard something. Whispers, faint, like they were coming from somewhere far away, but close enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stopped what I was doing and looked around. Of course, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the wind messing with me and went back to cleaning. I'd barely started scrubbing again when I saw it. A shadow, darting between the tombstones. My first thought was that it was just an animal, like a stray cat or something. I stood up, shined my flashlight in the direction where I'd seen the shadow, but there was nothing there. Just the old gravestones, half hidden by the overgrown weeds. Still, I felt uneasy, like there was something just out of sight, watching me. I forced myself to focus on the grave again. Don't be stupid. I told myself, you're alone. There's nothing out here. But that's when things really started getting strange. I noticed this snail, of all things, crawling slowly across the top of the headstone I was working on. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but there was something odd about this one. It was just sitting there, unmoving, almost like it was watching me. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but I couldn't help it. There was this nagging feeling, like it was more than just a regular snail. I tried to ignore it and kept cleaning, but every time I looked up, it had moved a little closer to me. It wasn't until the fourth or fifth time that I started to freak out. It was just a snail, right? I shouldn't be scared, but it was the way it moved, so slow. Out of nowhere, I heard footsteps behind me. I jumped, dropping my brush, and spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction. Nothing. Not a soul. But those footsteps had been real. I know they had. They were too heavy to be an animal. It sounded like boots, like someone walking up behind me. At this point, I was starting to panic. My hands were shaking, and I kept whipping my head around, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was out there. But the more I looked, the more I realized there was no one. Just shadows and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I wanted to leave right then, but something inside me, call it pride, stubbornness, whatever, kept me there. I wasn't going to let some stupid shadows and whispers scare me off. I was almost done with the grave, so I took a deep breath and knelt back down to finish the job. That's when I found it, the unmarked grave. I hadn't even noticed it at first. It was hidden beneath a thick layer of vines and dead leaves, tucked away between two larger graves. No headstone, no marker, nothing to indicate who was buried there. Just a patch of earth, sunken and uneven, like it had been forgotten for a long, long time. At that moment, I don't know what possessed me to start clearing it off. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that weird urge again, like I had to give this grave some attention, like someone needed to remember it. So I started pulling away the vines and brushing off the dirt. That's when the cold wind came back, stronger this time. It felt like it was coming from the ground itself, like it was seeping up from the grave, chilling me right to the bone. My flashlight flickered just for a second, but long enough to make my heart jump. The whispers started again, clearer this time, like they were right behind me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone, it was pleading, almost desperate. I froze, kneeling there in front of the grave. And then I felt it, a cold touch on my shoulder. It wasn't like a breeze or a stray leaf brushing past. No, this was different. It was solid, like someone had placed their hand on me. I shot up, spinning around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. But when I turned, there was nothing, no one. But I knew something had been there. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it all around. The shadows seemed darker now, more oppressive, like they were closing in on me. Every instinct I had was screaming me to run, to get out of there, but again I couldn't leave. Not yet. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to finish what I'd started. Something was holding me there. I went back to the grave, but this time I worked faster, brushing away the dirt with trembling hands. That's when I saw it, something carved into the stone beneath the earth. It wasn't a name, though. It was just a symbol, scratched deep into the stone. I didn't recognize it, but it looked old, ancient even. It was a spiral, with jagged lines cutting through it, almost like a broken wheel. I didn't have time to think about what it meant, because that's when the footsteps started again. My flashlight flickered once more, and this time, it went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. The footsteps grew louder, coming straight for me, but I couldn't see anything. Just the sound of heavy boots on the grass, getting closer and closer. I backed away, but the ground felt wrong beneath my feet, like it was shifting, moving. I stumbled, almost falling, when suddenly the footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet, too quiet. I stood there, frozen, holding my breath. I didn't dare move, didn't dare even blink. And then, just when I thought I was imagining it, I heard it. A soft, raspy breath, right next to my ear. I jerked away, swinging my arm through the air, but there was nothing there. My flashlight flickered back to life, casting a dim, shaky beam in front of me. That's when I saw it, the figure. It was standing over the unmarked grave, just a few feet away from where I'd been kneeling. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't human. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs and a face that seemed to blur in and out of focus, like I couldn't quite make sense of it. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, were dark, hollow voids, and they were locked on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it stood there, completely still, watching me. The whispers came back, louder now, almost deafening, but the figure didn't speak. It just stood there. And then, without warning, it started to dissolve, fading into the darkness like smoke. And just like that, it was gone. But the feeling wasn't. The air still felt heavy. My legs finally gave out, and I sat there on the ground, staring at the spot where the figure had been. I should have left right then, but instead, I did something I can't explain. Something I regret more than anything. I reached out and touched the grave. The second my fingers brushed the stone, it felt like a shock ran through my entire body. A jolt of ice-cold electricity surging up my arm and spreading through my chest. I pulled my hand back, gasping for air, but it was too late. I could feel it, this presence. I just wanted to get out of there. I grabbed my stuff and ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the cemetery. When I got home that night, I locked the door behind me, leaned against it, and just tried to catch my breath. My clothes were soaked in sweat, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head. Those hollow, empty eyes. I felt like they were still watching me, even though I was miles away from the cemetery. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen some ghost or spirit? I didn't even know if I believed it myself. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe that, at least. I could still feel that cold, heavy presence lingering around me, like it had followed me home. The nightmares started that very night. In the first one, I was back at the cemetery, standing over the unmarked grave. The wind was howling, and I could hear those whispers again, almost like they were speaking to me, but I couldn't make out the words. The grave was open now, a deep, black hole that seemed to go on forever. I could feel something down there, and then from the darkness a hand reached out, long and bony, and grabbed my ankle. I woke up gasping, my sheets twisted around me, my heart racing so fast it hurt. But even after I woke up, the cold stayed with me. It felt like I'd brought a piece of the grave back with me. My apartment, which had always felt warm and safe, now seemed cold and unfamiliar, like something had changed. The nightmares kept coming. Every night they got worse. And it wasn't just when I was asleep. I started hearing things during the day, whispers when no one was around, footsteps in the hall outside my apartment. Every time I looked in a mirror, I thought I saw something behind me, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned around, there was never anything there. Then, the worst part, the marks. About a week after that night in the cemetery, I woke up to find scratches on my arms, thin, red lines, like something had clawed at me while I was sleeping. I stared at them in the bathroom mirror. I couldn't explain it. They weren't deep, but they were too perfect to be from me tossing and turning in bed. And they didn't hurt, but just looking at them filled me with this creeping dread, like I knew somehow they meant something bad was coming. After that, things spiraled. I started seeing the figure again. Not fully, not like at the cemetery, but I'd catch glimpses of it in the shadows, at the end of the hallway, outside my window at night, always standing just far enough away that I couldn't be sure if it was real. But I knew it was the same thing. I tried everything to get rid of it. I even went back to the cemetery during the day, thinking maybe I could undo whatever had happened. I brought flowers, said a prayer, even though I'm not religious, but nothing worked. The figure didn't leave me alone. One night, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard the whispers again. Louder this time, like they were right next to me. I sat up, and there at the foot of my bed I saw it, the figure. It was closer now, its face still blurred, but those hollow eyes, they were locked on me. And then for the first time it spoke. It wasn't a voice, not really. More like a thought pushed into my mind, a single word that echoed over and over. Remember. I didn't know what it meant, but the word kept repeating in my head, growing louder, more insistent, until I thought I was going to lose my mind. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. It just kept going, drilling into my brain, until finally the figure vanished. When it was gone, the silence was almost worse. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something, like one wrong move would push me over into madness. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of my room, staring at the door, waiting for it to come back. The next day, I called in sick to work and decided to do some research to find out what that symbol I'd seen on the grave meant. It took hours of digging, but I finally found something, a reference to an old legend, something local, tied to the cemetery. Apparently, there's been a rumor about that place for years, about a spirit that haunts the unmarked graves. The story goes that back in the 1800s, there was a man, a gravedigger, who was accused of some terrible crime. They never proved he did it, but the townspeople didn't care. They took matters into their own hands and buried him alive in an unmarked grave, deep in the cemetery. Ever since then, anyone who disturbs his resting place is cursed, haunted by his spirit until they join him in the grave. I didn't want to believe it. I still don't. But after everything that's happened, I don't know what else to think. It's been weeks now, and the figure hasn't left me alone. The scratches on my arms have gotten worse, deeper, like whatever's haunting me is getting impatient. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I barely leave my apartment anymore. But the worst part is the dreams. They've changed. Now every night, I dream that I'm in that grave. I can feel the earth pressing down on me, cold and heavy, and I know that it's waiting for me. The whispers are always there, telling me to remember, but I don't know what I'm supposed to remember. I feel like I'm missing something, like there's a piece of the puzzle I can't see, and I'm scared that if I don't figure it out soon, I won't wake up one day. I couldn't keep living like this. Every day felt like I was slipping deeper into something I couldn't control. I was too afraid to sleep, too afraid to close my eyes, but the exhaustion, it was overwhelming. It felt like my body was shutting down, piece by piece. I had to figure out what remember meant, but nothing made sense. The more I tried to think, the more the answers seemed to slip away from me. Then one night, everything came to a head. It was around 3 a.m., and I was sitting in my living room, too scared to sleep. I had the TV on just for noise, trying to distract myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I could feel it, the presence. It was stronger than before, almost suffocating, and every shadow seemed to stretch longer, darker. That's when I heard the knock. It was soft, almost like a tap, but it came from inside my apartment. My blood ran cold. I got up, moving slowly. It was coming from my bedroom. As I reached the door, the knock came again. 3 soft taps, rhythmic. I opened the door, and there, standing in the middle of my room, was the figure. But it wasn't just a shadow anymore. I could see it clearly now. Its long, twisted limbs, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that didn't seem human. Its face was still blurry, like it was shifting in and out of focus. But the eyes, they were solid black, deep and endless. It stood there, completely still, its head slightly tilted, like it was waiting for me to speak. I couldn't move. The cold from the cemetery was back, and then in that same hollow, echoing voice, it spoke again. Remember. I swallowed hard, trying to form words, but my throat was dry. What do you want from me? I whispered, barely able to get the words out. It didn't move. It didn't blink, but I could feel its gaze on me. Remember. It said again, the word hanging in the air, heavy and full of something I couldn't understand. Suddenly, a flood of images hit me. Flashes of the cemetery, the grave, the symbol on the stone, and then something else. Something I hadn't remembered before. A memory, buried deep, I was a child, no more than 6 or 7. I was with my mother, walking through the same cemetery. She was holding my hand, leading me through the graves. We stopped in front of one, an unmarked grave. I didn't understand what we were doing there, but she knelt down and whispered something under her breath, something I couldn't hear. Then she turned to me, her face pale, her eyes full of fear, and said, "Never come here again, Emily. Never disturb this place." I had forgotten that day, or maybe I had blocked it out. But now, standing there in my bedroom, it all came rushing back. My mother had known. She had known about the grave, about the curse, but she had never told me why. The figure took a step forward. "Remember," it said again, its voice more urgent now, like it was demanding something from me. And then I realized it wasn't just telling me to remember the past. It wanted me to remember what I had done. The flashes came again. I saw myself at the cemetery years ago as a teenager. I had been angry that day after a fight with my mother. I went to the cemetery to clear my head, wandering aimlessly, and I ended up at that grave again, the same unmarked grave. I had kicked at the dirt, out of frustration, disturbing the ground, not realizing what I was doing. I had broken the seal. That's why the figure was following me. That's why the curse had latched onto me. I had disturbed something I shouldn't have, and now it wanted me to pay for it. The figure moved closer, its twisted hand reaching out toward me. I backed away. I didn't know what to do. How was I supposed to fix this? How could I stop it? Suddenly, the figure stopped, its hand hovering in the air, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it began to fade, dissolving into the shadows. But before it disappeared completely, it whispered one last word. "Rest." I stood there, staring at the empty space where it had been. Rest? What did that mean? Did it want me to go back to the grave to finish what I had started? Or was it something else? Something final? The word echoed in my head over and over. The next day, I knew what I had to do. I went back to the cemetery, back to the unmarked grave. It looked the same as it had that night, cold, forgotten, covered in vines and dirt. But this time I wasn't here to disturb it. I was here to set things right. I knelt down in front of the grave. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I felt like I had to apologize. I had to make peace with whatever was buried here. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I didn't know." For a long moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, I felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. The cold began to lift, the heavy presence that had been suffocating me for weeks finally easing. And then, for the first time since that night, I felt at peace. I stood up, taking one last look at the grave. I didn't know if the figure would come back, or if the nightmares would stop, but for now, the weight had lifted. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure, like I had finally put something to rest. But deep down, I knew the cemetery was far from done with me, and I would never forget what I had seen.